Morning. So good to be back. Peg and I were away, as you know, and we were there for the birth of our seventh grandchild. So that went really well, and we're thankful to God and thankful to you for your prayers on behalf of our daughter Beth and her new baby son Malcolm, and that all went really well, and we really appreciate being able to be there for that. It was a very special time for us. There are several in our midst, or a number, who continue to need our prayers, and we're mindful of them. Our grandson Tobias is going to have surgery tomorrow, and we would like for you to pray for his full recovery. And there are others as well that we need to be praying for. Before I preached in a series of sermons on women in the Bible, upon lessons that we learn from women in the Bible. And the first lesson I talked about acts of kindness, that one of the things that we learn from women in the Bible is the power and the importance, the helpfulness of acts of kindness. And the women in the Bible are celebrated or held up as examples of the kind of human beings that we need to be. And while the Bible doesn't necessarily embrace the values of the world with respect to women and how women are to be regarded and treated, it instead embraces the values of heaven, the kind of things that matter to God. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of women in the Bible who uphold those values. Things that are not necessarily impressive to the world, are the kinds of things the world cares about, but the things God cares about. And acts of kindness are certainly one of those things that God cares deeply about. But also acts of faith. All of the godly women in the Bible uphold the standard of faith that we are to have as human beings, created in God's image, the kind of creatures that God made us to be. And in performing acts of faith, women in the Bible teach all of us how we ought to be in our life. We ought to be people of faith. Now, faith is a kind of word that a lot of people kind of narrow down in their definition to just believing something to be true. And certainly that's part of it. Having faith is believing something to be true, specifically that there is a God and that God made this world. But it goes beyond just believing a fact or a point of data. It is believing in God himself, believing in his character and his personality, and trusting in him and wanting to be of service to him. And that's where the acts come in, the acts of faith. When you really believe in God and you embrace him, put your faith in him, trust him, then you act accordingly. In the world, people teach you to believe in yourself, to follow your own dictates, to exalt yourself, to seek empowerment based upon your own ability. The world would teach us to celebrate those kinds of things, but in the Bible, we're taught that our real power, our real empowerment comes from our God and trusting in him. And there are many, many examples of women in the Bible who did this. I'm going to talk about that for a few moments this morning. The first one we're going to talk about is Sarah, the wife of Abraham. And we read, for instance, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 11, about Sarah's faith. The Hebrew writer tells us, by faith Sarah, even though she was barren and beyond the proper age, was enabled to conceive a child because she considered him faithful who had promised. Sarah's empowerment did not come from a philosophical construct. It didn't come from cultural wokeness. Her empowerment came from God and her faith in God. Sarah is held up as an example of the kind of woman that all women should be. And one of the most important things about Sarah was her faith in God. She had a child, even though she was not able to have children. She had a child, even though she was very, very old, in her 90s. And that was a miracle. And it came from God. But in order for that wonderful blessing to occur, it was necessary for Sarah to have faith. She needed to believe in that God. And she did. And so it wasn't about believing in herself. It wasn't about believing in values and vanities of this world. But believing in an all-powerful God, a creator God, a God who can call life from death. She believed in him. She struggled with that faith. It wasn't easy for her. Imagine if you in your 90s was told you're going to have a child and having to accept that. That's what Sarah did. And there's a couple of points that I want to derive from that. In fact, there's a lot of lessons that you can derive from Sarah's faith, but one of them that I would point out is that Sarah's faith was just as essential to the process as Abraham's. The Bible talks a lot about Abraham's faith, and of course that was very important. That was a very essential thing, and Abraham's faith is held up to all of us as an example of the kind of people that we ought to be in our life, that we believe in God's promises in spite of how challenging that might be at times, and in spite of how distant the fulfillment of those promises may seem. We still need to believe in God's promises. But you know, Sarah's faith was just as important in that process. That's what the Hebrew writer is pointing out in Hebrews chapter 11. She wasn't just a device, a tool, a receptacle that God used to bring a child into the world in spite of whatever she thought or felt. No, she needed to believe it just like Abraham needed to believe it. And she did. We men in the service of Jesus Christ, we men in the congregation, we need to have faith. Our women need to have faith too. You women, you mothers, you wives. Your faith is essential to the health of this congregation. And your acts of faith, based upon your convictions, are relished by God, required by God, for us to be the human beings who bring the light of the truth of God into this world, who allow God to fulfill what he's trying to accomplish in this world. The faith of women, the faith of men, our faith, all of us together, serving together, acting together upon our faith, is required. It is essential. Sarah is an example of that, teaches us that. We also learn from Sarah's faith that faith is not just about wanting something. You would think it would be easy to believe in something that you really want. And wanting it may help a little bit, Sarah really wanted a child, had desperately wanted a child for years and years and years, decades of her life. She didn't have one. You can see where she would eventually resign herself not to having a child. But it's not enough to want something. In our case, to want salvation, to want forgiveness, to want resurrection. It's not enough to want it. If you think that's what faith is, then you're mistaken. The thing that we want is a wonderful, beautiful, wondrous thing. But it transcends our experience in this life. It transcends this world. It transcends the things that we come to expect and not expect because of how hard and difficult and challenging this life is. And so, while we want heaven and we want to be with God, the disappointments of this life drag us down. And we get to the point where we don't really expect, believe that those things are going to happen. And so we need to reinvigorate our faith like Sarah did. Pierce through her doubts and embrace what God is saying He is going to do, because He is going to do it. Just as He did for Sarah. He's going to bring life from death. And to act as Sarah acted on that faith. And last of all, Sarah teaches us about faith. That it's not just a dream. It's God's promise that we're believing in. God's promise. And that's what convinced Sarah. God said it. It's not because I say it. It's because God says it. It's not just because these people around you in this congregation say it. It's because God says it. God sends His Son into this world, a descendant of this child that Sarah had, to fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham to bless all nations through his seed. And God says, it's going to happen. I'm going to do it. That's what our faith lies in. Sarah embraced that promise. And she had that child. And we're blessed through that child. We are blessed. In consequence of Sarah's faith. And we need to share it. We need to have Sarah's faith. Exodus chapter 2, we read about another woman in the Bible, Jochebed, her mother of Moses. And we read in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 1, now a man from the house of Levi went and married the daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. Now, you know the backstory, that the Egyptians held the Israelites in slavery, and the Israelites were becoming so numerous that the Egyptians were afraid that they would outnumber them, and so they enforced a law that says all male children should be put to death. And so Jochebed had this male child, and she was supposed to put him to death or have him put to death, and she couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. And you might think, well, that's just an act of natural human love or motherly instinct. And I'm sure that had a lot to do with it, but Hebrews tells us it was also an act of faith. Hebrews 11 and verse 23, we read, by faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after his birth because they saw that he was a beautiful child And they were unafraid of the king's edict. Now, this verse says his parents, because I'm sure both of them were involved. But Exodus tells us that it was a decision by Jochebed, his mother, primarily. Because, we all know that when it comes to taking care of a child, mom is going to be heavily involved. And so she did this, not just because she loved the child, not just because she adored him, but because she had faith. Because you see, this decision put her life at risk because of the authorities and the law that they had passed. And we learn from Jochebed that in order to commit acts of faith in the service of God, it's not necessarily always in our interest. There are cross currents in that decision. Acts of faith are things that can bring blessings to us, but they can also bring hardship and risk and threats. The Hebrew writer says that they did not fear the king's edict, but there was certainly enough there to be afraid of. And so they acted out of faith and trust that somehow that this would work out, that if they honored God more than the king, that they would be all right. You understand how hard it must have been for Jochebed, keeping that child quiet, hiding him away, not knowing if she would be discovered and what would happen if she was. But she acted out of faith. Faith determined her behavior in the end. Not just her self-interest, not just her affection for her child, but her faith. We need mothers like that. Most mothers love their children. That's true in the world as well as in the service of God. But it is those mothers who have faith in God that can truly be the kind of mothers that they need to be. In my life, I've had many mothers that have been essential to my faith. My grandmother was a woman of faith, and she raised my father to have faith. And he married my mother, and she became a woman of great faith. And I stand here before you today largely in a consequence of my grandmother and my mother's faith. We need that. We need that in our homes. We need that in the church. We need that. We need mothers of faith. Because just like the Egyptian soldiers would break into their homes and take those little children away and kill those little boys, the world is out there trying to steal the souls of our children. We need mothers of faith to protect them. But that faith is not just about self-interest. It's not just about affection. It's not just about loving your little child. Most mothers do. It's about making determinations on how you're going to teach them and raise them and treat them in keeping with your faith in Almighty God. That's what Jochebed teaches us. about faith. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 31 talks about another woman, Rahab. Faith Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Rahab's another great example of a woman in the Bible, a woman who did not let her gender or her past or her status define her. Now, in the world in which she lived, the way that people looked at her because of her gender and her past behavior and her status, they would look at her and they would define her a certain way. And I can understand why women would want to push back against that and say, I don't think you should treat me this way because I'm a woman or because I've made these mistakes. I don't think you should treat me this way, disrespect me because of my status in this community, in this life. I understand why women would push back from that. But in the end, those are not the things that concern God. And those things, if you overcome the world looking down on you because you're a woman or because you've had this checkered past or because you don't have the same kind of power or status that other people do or perhaps men have, even if you overcome those things, it won't matter in the end. But what Rahab found that really delivered her was faith in Almighty God. She came to hear about this God, the God of Israel, and she believed in that God, even though it wasn't the God that she was raised with, even though she had this checkered past. She believed that this God of Israel could save her. And she acted on that faith. And because of that, she became a hero of faith in the Bible. She's in that great chapter of faith, Hebrews chapter 11, and she's held up, she's respected, she's dignified, she's lauded because she was a woman of faith and she acted on her faith. And because of that, it didn't matter that she was a woman. It didn't matter even that she had been a prostitute. It didn't matter that she wasn't respected in her community. None of that mattered. What mattered is that God saved her because she believed in him. That's all that matters to her now. I can tell you that. 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 2 through 3 tells us about a young girl, who was captured as an act of war and taken into slavery, essentially slavery in the service of Naaman, one of the captains in the army of Syrians. And her master, Naaman, became sick with leprosy, and she spoke up. And we read here in 2 Kings 5, verse 2, a young girl from Israel. She served as Naaman's servant, his wife's servant. She said to her mistress, if only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. Now, what a remarkable thing to say. Why would she even care about this master who had captured her and taken her away from her family and from her home, and she was serving him? But no, she was just a girl who cared about other people. But more than that, she believed in the prophet of God and what he could do. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that remarkable? Nobody would pick her status. No one would say, you know what, I want to be a slave girl in the house of some foreign dignitary. I want to be yanked away from my home and my family and taken off and be this slave girl. Nobody would choose that life, that status, that position. Nobody would choose that. And a lot of people would kick back from that and say, I refuse to be disrespected like this. Well, all right. I understand the sentiment. But we need to understand that the true significance of our lives while we're here and what our lives will mean when they're over with, it doesn't rest upon the status that the world values us with. It doesn't mean anything in the end. It won't matter after the gravestone has worn away to the point that you can't even read who this person was, when they lived, what they did, when all of the references are wiped away, burned away, and gone. When your bones have moldered to the point where they can't even be distinguished from the dirt. At that point, none of those things are going to matter. But what will matter is what we believed in, who we believed in. That will matter. And this young girl had this innocent faith, this, just matter-of-fact faith. I know that prophet of God can heal my master. I know that he can. And because of that innocent faith, that faith in that girl, that young woman, something wonderful was done. Something recorded in the Bible, in the history of God's people. I don't even know her name. Maybe one day we'll get to know her name, huh? Yeah. Get to know her. What kind of status do you think she has now? What kind of life do you think she has now? And what she was able to accomplish with this faith that she had in her heart. More powerful than all the army of the Syrians, because all the army of the Syrians couldn't have healed Naaman. But the faith of this little girl led to his healing. It's the same kind of faith that we all need, that will lead to our healing as well. John 4, verse 19, we read about the woman at the well in Samaria. And the woman at the well in Samaria, she had a little bit of a checkered past, and she probably wasn't respected very well in her community either. And she was a woman, and as a woman, her job was to go out to the well and draw water and take it back into town and water the animals and wash the clothes. And, a lot of people today would push back from that kind of life and say, well, that's demeaning, and, she should have the right to have greater aspirations in her life. I'm not going to argue with you about that. But let me tell you about this woman. Jesus meets her, and I think he probably came there to that very well for the very purpose of meeting her. And he started talking with her, and she said, "Sir, I can see that you're a prophet." Now that's pretty remarkable, isn't it? That she could tell by some of the things that Jesus had said, and she had enough conviction about these matters that he was a prophet. A lot of women in the world today can't see that Jesus is a prophet, but she did. And later on in the conversation, the woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." She had that conviction. Her religion may have been wrong for the most part, because she was a Samaritan and her religion was kind of off base. And she may have had a checkered past, and maybe the guy she was living with, she shouldn't have been living with. But you know what? She believed in the Messiah. She believed the Messiah was coming. And there's a lot of women today who don't have that conviction. But she did. And finally, after her conversation was over with, she ran back in town and she said to her fellow villagers, "Come, see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" And they all come out and they hear Jesus. Now, let me tell you something about this woman. She was wrong in a lot of ways. Wrong maybe in her moral behavior, wrong in her religion, and perhaps disrespected by her community, but she had faith. She believed. She believed in God, the God of Israel. She believed the Messiah was coming, and when he came, she believed in him. And that made all the difference in her life. In fact, it was the only thing that really mattered in the end. It didn't matter that she was a woman. It didn't matter that she had this checkered past, because that was all washed away. Because the Messiah did come and speak to her, and she embraced faith in him. You see? That's what matters. That's what's significant. Mark chapter 7, another woman, a woman immediately whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, heard that Jesus was in town, and she came running, and she fell down at his feet, and she begged him. She said, "Please heal my daughter." And it says that the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of his daughter, And Jesus seems at first to be somewhat dismissive of her, and there's different theories about exactly what Jesus says and what it means and what he was trying to accomplish and the message he was trying to send his disciples. But let's set all that aside and just look at this woman. Why we're told about her. Why were you told about this woman? Because she had faith. She's an example of faith. There's a lot of rich, dignified Jewish women who didn't come and fall at the feet of Jesus. But this foreign woman did. I don't know anything about her. Don't know about her background, except that she was a Gentile. She had this daughter. Don't know her name. Don't know her status. Don't know how she dressed. I don't know if she was empowered or if she was respected. I don't know anything about that. I don't know. I can tell you this. She ignored all of the barriers, all of the human concerns, all of the things that people worry about and care about, of nationality, of gender, of these things that people use to separate themselves into different categories. I don't know anything about that with respect to her. She didn't care about that. She knew that there was a power there. She knew that there was someone there who could heal her daughter, and that's what she cared about. And so she comes to Jesus and asks for his help because she believed he could help. That's what she believed in. She believed in Jesus. She acted on that faith. Simple faith. And in that moment, that's all that mattered, was her faith. And I tell you now, if she remained a believer in Jesus, that's all that matters now. Not that she was a woman, not that she was a Gentile, not any of the things that the trappings of this life. None of that matters. What matters is the one that she came to and asked for his help. And he did help her. Because in the end, he's the only one that can. Would that everyone had that kind of faith. Men, women, all of us. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 20. Just then a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said, "If I can only touch his cloak, if I could just touch the tassel of his cloak, I will be healed." Now let me tell you something about this woman. Jesus turns to her and he says, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. Here's one of these dozens and dozens of women who are held up and honored and respected and dignified in the Bible. Held as being worthy of God's love. admired, not just by the men who wrote the Bible, but by the God who inspired them to write the Bible. God, in the form of Jesus, in the body of Jesus, God is the one saying to this woman, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has healed you." So, she was a woman, and she was unclean, because if you have an issue of blood, you remain unclean, and therefore untouchable. The other Jews weren't supposed to come around, weren't supposed to touch this woman. And so, to a large degree, she would have been an outcast, someone not respectable, if you will. But none of that mattered, right? Woman, not supposed to be running up and touching this great rabbi. Certainly not an unclean woman. But status didn't matter. It was her faith in the power of Jesus that mattered. And she had that faith, and she reached out to take hold of him, to touch him, because she believed in him. And the reality is that Jesus it didn't matter to him either. It didn't matter to him that she was a woman, or that she had this issue of blood. He wanted to cleanse her. He saw her faith. He admired it. He appreciated it. And she was saved by it. You see that? You see the idea conveyed in all these stories? These women of faith. In conclusion, brethren, there's a lot of lessons that you can derive from women in the Bible, but the point of the matter is that they're just human beings. Men of faith, women of faith, human beings of faith in the Bible. And then there's men who are wicked and evil and without faith in God, and women who are wicked and evil and without faith in God. And what distinguishes them is not their gender. What distinguishes them in the Bible, what makes them human beings of worth, of quality, and eventually of salvation, is their faith. For all of us, about the faith that we need to have. Our power, our status will not save us. You won't be saved because you're a man. You won't be saved because you're a woman. You won't be saved because you're intelligent or skilled or educated, or you are empowered, or if you have status, or you've been able to achieve all of the things you want to achieve in life, or that the world respects you or treats you in a dignified way. None of that will matter in the end. It won't save you. It won't. Only faith in God will. Only faith in God. And if you have that, it doesn't matter whether you have any of the rest or not. It'll be the only thing that matters. So that we need, all of us. That is what we need to value. That is what we need to lift up and say, this is what we hold in esteem. Faith in Jesus Christ, who comes into this world and pushes away all of the vanities, all of the nonsense of this life, of this world that men hold in such high regard. He pushes it all aside. And he reaches out to men and women of faith. And says, your faith has saved you. If you have that kind of faith this morning, and you want to act on it, act on your faith in Jesus Christ. Reach out to Him by declaring your faith in Jesus. Turning away from sin in the world, the things that the world values. And take take on the name of Jesus in baptism and let Him wash your sins away. If you'll do that today, your faith will make you well. Let us know if you want to as we stand and sing.